Ecosystems take into account not just the living things in an environment, but also the non-living features of an environment. And so ecosystem ecology seeks to understand those non-living components of the environment and how it affects living things. And so there's two aspects of that we'll focus on, energy and how energy flows through systems, and chemicals and how chemicals cycle within systems. So the first thing we'll take a look at is energy flow. This topic is something that many people have been introduced to before with the concept of food chains. So energy flow is the movement of energy in an ecosystem, and it tends to flow from like a base to higher organisms in what's called a food chain, which is a linear depiction of energy flow. So it's just a diagram that shows how energy flows through the system. Within a food chain, we have feeding levels called trophic levels. So kind of like a technical term, using that root troph for feeding. And so for every feeding food chain, the base of that food chain is almost always some producer, and that's a photosynthetic producer. So that's oftentimes usually plants, especially in terrestrial ecosystems. And then another term that we'll see here is food web. A food web includes many food chains and the interrelationships between food chains in an ecosystem. So a food web is more complex and demonstrates the more complex set of relationships than just a single food chain. So this is an example of a food chain, two different examples actually, an aquatic one and a terrestrial food chain. And so for example, we see plants as the base of this food chain. Caterpillars eat the plants, lizards eat the caterpillars, and the snake eats the lizard. Likewise, we have this aquatic food chain where we have phytoplankton, which are photosynthetic as the base of the food chain, zooplankton that eat the phytoplankton, fish that eat the zooplankton, and pelicans that eat the fish. So there's a set of terms that are defined for the different species that are part of the food chain. But first, let me remind you about two big terms here, autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that can harvest light or chemical energy and store it in bonds. And this is the process of photosynthesis that you've learned a lot about before. So organisms that carry out photosynthesis are more specifically called photoautotrophs. And the photoautotrophs are typically, again, the base of most food chains. You do have some bacteria that can use things other than light. These are called chemoautotrophs, and these are very rare, like lightless, bottom of the ocean type ecosystems. The autotrophs are also referred to as primary producers in the context of a food chain. So we see here the phytoplankton and the plants are the primary producers. Everything that eats other things, those are heterotrophs. They eat other organisms, but we also, in the context of a food chain, call them consumers. And depending on where they are in the food chain, they're either primary, secondary, tertiary, even quaternary consumers, so a fourth level if necessary. So the first level of consumption, the thing that eats the plant, is the primary consumer. These are also a lot of times called herbivores, so they eat plants. A secondary consumer is a carnivore. It's at the next level, eating the herbivore. And then a tertiary consumer eats a carnivore, another carnivore, so it's at that next level. We also have detrivores in food webs. Detrivores are also known as decomposers. They eat detritus, so that's where the name detrivore comes from. And that's waste, either plant waste, remains of animals, or waste products. And so these can appear at multiple trophic levels depending on what the detrivore is decomposing. And they're actually really super essential in food chains. They don't oftentimes get represented because they don't hunt, for example, but they're recycling chemicals and making them available for other organisms, and that's a critical function. We've talked about many detrivores throughout the semester. Fungi and bacteria are both major detrivores. So where are humans in a typical food chain? Well, humans play many roles. In some cases, we're primary consumers. In some cases, we're secondary consumers. And in some ways, we're tertiary consumers, depending on what we're eating. So if you're eating a lettuce or a tomato, you're a primary consumer. If you are eating a cow, you're being a secondary consumer. If you're eating, let's see, like a bear, you're being a tertiary consumer. You'll see that for the most part, we tend to mainly be secondary consumers because of energy efficiency. So that's where we're headed as we talk about this subject more, but you have lost less energy if you're staying in the lower levels of the food chain. So a food web is a diagram that represents interconnected food chains, and it shows how all of the different organisms within an ecosystem are eating or being eaten by multiple organisms. And so you can see, for example, that the base of this food chain actually includes multiple primary producers, and that, for example, the red oat grass is being eaten by several different things. And the Thompson's gazelle is being eaten by several different things. And so it just shows the more realistic approach that organisms are a part of a complex system. They're not just feeding one organism or just eating one organism. But obviously, they're a lot harder to read than a food chain. So we often isolate a food chain, even if we are keeping in mind that in the broader context, they're part of a food web. So when we look at food webs and food chains, we see that chain lengths are normally short. So in our examples, we saw tertiary consumers as the highest level. Really, you don't get much higher than a quaternary consumer. So usually less than 6 trophic levels at the very most. And the reason why is because fundamentally the energy runs out, okay? And that is because energy is lost within a trophic level. So everything is kind of, the amount of energy available is kind of set by the plants. That's the maximum amount of energy available to everybody else in the food chain. And so your primary consumers are accessing some of that energy, and then they're passing that on to the secondary consumers, and they're passing that on to the tertiary consumers. And every time that energy gets passed from one trophic level to another, energy is being lost. And so part of this is just due to the second law of thermodynamics, which says that energy conversions are not 100% efficient, that in any transfer process, some energy must be sort of given off to the universe, if you will. In our previous bio classes, we sometimes talk about this as the unusable energy or the energy of disorder. So this is the entropy that we've talked about in previous classes. And so not all of the energy that the plants captured is ever going to be available for other organisms because of this energy cost. In addition, when energy is being transferred from trophic level to trophic level, there's not 100% passage and ability to transfer that energy just because of digestive limitations. So we obviously don't digest everything we consume. That's why we have to go to the bathroom. And so there's quite a bit of stuff that just is not able to be efficiently digested. So to understand energy transfer, we can actually do some measurements to get an idea of how efficient energy transfer is. And there's 2 values we'll look at: production efficiency and trophic level transfer efficiency. Production efficiency is a way to measure the amount of energy that's actually incorporated into an organism's body. So it's actually like looking at growth and biomass. So this can be done like measured by using weights, for example. We see that if this caterpillar eats 1,000 joules, and joules is just an energy measurement. You may or may not be familiar with it, which is what this J represents. It's similar to an energy measurement you may be more familiar with, calories. So it's an alternative measurement compared to calories. So if this caterpillar ate 1,000 joules worth of energy from its food, so there it is eating that leaf, it actually loses most of that as feces. So it doesn't have very good digestion. So half of what it eats, it can't digest, and it loses most of that. And then a fair amount of that is used to just maintain its metabolism. So just to maintain its daily energy requirements, it had to use 320 joules. And so it could only incorporate 180 joules into making its body bigger. And so that would be the measure of its production efficiency. It would be 180 out of 1,000. So I'll write that there, 180 out of 1,000, which comes out to be about 18% production efficiency. If you look at this squirrel, it ate 1,000 joules. It has a much more efficient digestive system. So notice that it loses a lot less in its feces. And the reason why it has to have such an efficient digestive system is because look at how much it loses to cellular respiration. Quite a bit is lost just to do its daily maintenance energy requirements. And this is because the squirrel is endothermic. So there's a higher energy cost just to daily life if you're endothermic. And we see that represented here by the squirrel versus the caterpillar. And so that leaves just 16 joules for growth. And so that is equivalent to 1.6% production efficiency. And so this lines up with our general values here. Invertebrates like caterpillars average 10 to 40%. The caterpillar is relatively low with only 18%. And when we look at vertebrates, they have much lower production efficiencies, especially endothermic animals, the birds and the mammals, which are only in the 1 to 2% production efficiency. So not a lot of energy transfer occurring here. And why the biomass is important, so think about this. The growth of the caterpillar, it's only whatever the caterpillar uses to grow that would be available to something that ate the caterpillar. Okay, so that's why we're not counting cellular respiration. The cellular respiration, it did use the plant to do that cellular respiration, but it can't pass on that energy to the next level. So we focus on growth because that's what an animal that ate the caterpillar or ate the squirrel could use. Trophic level transfer efficiency focuses, instead of on individual organisms, on the collective amount of organisms within an ecosystem. So here, looking at trophic level transfer efficiency, notice I'm not looking at a caterpillar or a squirrel. I'm looking at autotrophs collectively in an ecosystem, herbivores collectively, carnivores at the first level, second level, and tertiary level. So primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer. And so what happens is that within a trophic level, we see some loss. So notice how this tips down, right? It's not a straight line. So that means within the autotrophs, they lose some energy as heat. The herbivores lose energy as heat. That's that entropy that we were talking about, okay? So that means they can't pass on that energy. And then in addition to that, there's also the loss of energy between levels. So this is that waste from digestion, as well as the energy needs of cellular respiration of the individuals. So this is the loss that we were talking about before in the previous example. And so what you see here is less than 50% of the energy a lot of times being available. And so this was the maximum amount of energy at the start because this is what plants were capturing from the sun. And as we transfer between levels, there's really almost nothing left by the time you get to the top level of carnivores. And so that's why, as we said at the beginning here, you can only have about 6 trophic levels within a chain before there's really not any energy left to transfer anymore. So this energy flow idea of having more energy in the first level, trying to point with my finger here, more energy at the first level and less energy as you move down that way, also predicts that you would have less organisms that can survive in each level. So if you have only so much energy left for the third level of carnivore, you'd sort of predict there might be less of these carnivores, and there can be more of these carnivores and slightly more of these carnivores and slightly more herbivores. And that's what's called a pyramid of numbers. So the energy flow idea predicts what's called a pyramid of numbers for organisms. Oops, the right thing here. So again, this is called a pyramid of numbers. It says the numbers of individuals typically decreases at each trophic level. So here's a grassland example where we see there's a very large amount of plants at the base. only 200,000 insects that are eating those plants, only 90,000 predatory insects eating those herbivore insects, and only one bird eating the predatory insects. So again, we see a narrowing, a pyramid shape as we move up the food chain. However, in some cases, you won't see a pyramid of numbers, like when you have trees. Trees are really small, really large compared to grass. And so a tree might be able to provide a lot of food to, one tree might provide a lot of food to a large amount of insects. And so in order to see the pyramid, you really have to look at a pyramid of biomass to see a pyramid shape when you're looking at a tree ecosystem. And so many people say, well, really, we need to focus on a pyramid of energy. So you will always see a pyramid of energy because, again, just like we were talking about, the plants have the most energy, and we lose energy as we move up the trophic level. But again, typically that's going to correlate to a period of numbers where you have very small numbers of organisms at the top. The other consequence of energy flow and food chains is that because of that pyramid structure, where you have typically more organisms at the bottom and less organisms at the top, if you have some finite toxin, like say you have, I'll use really simple numbers here, like 100 grams of a toxin, and at your base you have 100 organisms, then that would be 1 gram of toxin per organism. But because of the pyramid of numbers, you might only have 1 organism at the top. And so that same 100 grams, as it travels up the food chain, will concentrate so that you have 100 grams in that 1 organism. So at the base of the food chain, it was distributed across 100 organisms, so that gave the toxin load being only 1 gram per organism. But at the top of the food chain, because of the pyramid of numbers, you would have a toxin load of 100 grams per 1 organism. And so at the lower levels of the food chain, the amount of the toxin might not be significant, but by the time you get to the top of the food chain, those levels might be toxic. And so we have seen this this idea play out with multiple contaminants in our environment. And I don't know if I said this yet. This is called biomagnification, this idea that toxins concentrate as we move up the food chain. So one well-known example is mercury. So mercury is present in the environment due to human pollution. Fossil fuels burning releases mercury into the air, and then the mercury settles back into waterways. And so that mercury tends to kind of land down in the bottom mud of waterways. And so you can see in that mud a really low concentration of the mercury. And this is in parts per million. And then the organisms that are feeding and living in that mud, many of them decomposers, start to concentrate that mercury. So inside of their bodies, they've started to accumulate a slightly higher amount. The fish that eat those insects, again, because they're higher up on the food chain, are starting to accumulate a higher concentration of that mercury. And then gulls that eat the fish have, again, a significantly higher amount of the mercury. And so again, the risk here is that as you move up the food chain, something that started as a really insignificant level of a toxin reaches levels that can be fatal. And this is the concern, by the way, you've probably heard this with mercury in humans. So children and pregnant women are advised to not eat too much fish because fish have concentrated mercury into their bodies, and depending on the type of fish, they have more or less mercury. So generally things like tuna, swordfish, shark, these are all higher level predators in the food chain, and so they have higher amounts of mercury in their bodies. Whereas if you're eating sardines or mackerel, they're much lower on the food chain, and so they have less mercury in their bodies, and so those are considered generally safer. And for why children and pregnant women? Well, because mercury is a neurotoxin, particularly during development. So once you're an adult, it's not great for you, let's be clear, but it's not as damaging to you as it is to children and to developing and to babies developing inside of their mothers. So that's why pregnant women are advised to not do it or not eat too much fish. Another well-known example is DDT. DDT was an insecticide that was started to be in common use in the 1940s. One of the big challenges with DDT is, like mercury, it persisted in the environment. So once they had sprayed DDT, it was always there. It didn't go away. So it would accumulate in the soil. And then once it had accumulated in the soil, it started to move up the food chain, just like we talked about here. And so the levels of DDT that were accumulating in birds are believed to have interfered with eggshell formation. And so the eggshells were basically weak. And this affected the ability of the birds to reproduce. And so starting in the 1950s and through the 1960s, there was a major decline in all kinds of birds, especially the predatory birds, because they were at the top of the food chain. The U.S. eventually banned DDT. It's still able to be used in a lot of other countries. And there was a whole host of reasons other than the birds why DDT was banned. But it was a major problem in the same way due to biomagnification. One of the birds that was really affected by DDT was the American bald eagle. This is the national bird of the United States. In the 1700s, it's estimated that there were 100,000 nesting pairs of bald eagles in the lower 48 states. But by 1963, there were only 487 nesting pairs. So that was a major, major decline. And there was a host of reasons, not just DDT, for that decline, including, of course, habitat loss due to humans, hunting, and other issues. However, DDT did not help the situation. Starting in the 1960s and 70s, there started to be programs and concern given to the American bald eagle population. And so you can see that it has been in recovery for a long time now. It's been delisted, so it's no longer listed as an endangered species. And actually, you can see bald eagles in Aurora in the wintertime. There's nesting pairs in the Denver metro area as well. So quite a nice recovery for a species that was affected by biomagnification.